The night pressed the ground with its weight. The few bare trees that had miraculously survived near our trench stretched their thin, icy branches toward the sky. But we did not regard them as comrades in misfortune. On such a night, every living creature has enough of its own worries, and has no concern for other sufferers. I stood motionless for a while, gazing intently into the darkness. I should have looked around. There were enemy soldiers in the thick reeds ahead. Apparently they were very numerous and well armed. It seemed to me that the machine gun bursts of the Russians now sounded closer. On the right and left, German machine guns occasionally snapped back. I decided to check how things were on our line, what condition the soldiers and officers were in. Walking along the trench, I made a discovery that too saddened me. The men remained only in the immediate vicinity of me. All the other brave soldiers had scattered. I tried my best. I chose the most favorable position for each of them, checked the ammunition. And here I was waiting for another very unpleasant discovery. Only very few of them had full magazines, that is, 6 cartridges. No one had a spare. What's 6 rounds? I walked along the line again, told everyone to be ready, and not to fire without real confidence that you would hit your target. Then I went back to my spot, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat down in the snow. The frost was terrible. Even sitting in the trench, I had to move my legs all the time to keep them from freezing. By that time, we already had a huge number of frostbite. Many soldiers replaced their shoes with pieces of blankets or furs, tying them to their feet with ropes. I had a very strong desire to follow the example of the majority and hide somewhere far away before it was too late. But I managed to overcome it. Besides, although I didn't realize it yet, a few hours of sleep in the freezing stable had restored my strength. Continuing to keep my ears perked up so as not to miss anything important, I began to slowly pray. Apparently God had left my prayers unheeded. How unnecessary now seemed many things that I had prioritized in my peaceful life. Study, for example. What a foolish waste of time. Only God and my mother's love were true. It was then, in the pitch darkness of the pre-dawn hours, waiting for an enemy attack, and therefore most likely death, that I realized the true value of many things. Time dragged on slowly. Nothing much was happening. Sometimes I stopped whispering prayers and started stomping my feet, jumping up and down and patting myself with my hands to keep warm. I had a feeling I couldn't last another hour in that cold. What about half an hour? Of course not. That's so long. So the long hours passed. In my mind's eye, I saw the sun-drenched gardens of the Riviera. How warm it was. Warm. What an incredible, marvelous, delightful thing it is to be warm. Lord, help me to feel it again someday. No one was firing at our positions. Disoriented by our silence, the enemy gradually came closer. Very slowly, but they were getting closer. Just in front of our trench was a natural earth fold, a narrow passage where the Major had sent some pariahs to reconnoiter. They returned very quickly. Running up to our trench, panting, they reported that the Russians were very near. I looked at the Germans positioned on the right. They looked, as always, calm and completely impassive. Pulling their huge white hoods over their helmets, the Germans stood motionless near their machine guns. To the left was the same picture. The German troops were well fed, sleeping in the warmth, rotating every few hours. They were perfectly uniformed and armed, and the discipline and organization in general above all praise. The sky began to lighten. The Russians always attack at dawn. They're as uninventive and monotonous as their scenery. We knew from experience that they almost never deviate from the order once established. Everything turned against us. The frost had become absolutely fierce. It was the coldest we'd ever felt. In addition, the enemy was inevitably approaching, and it was on the section of the line of defense that we occupied. The fury of the coming attack seemed to be upon us. I walked once more along our trench. There were even fewer men left. Apparently, the Germans had decided to handle the situation in their own way. They sent 2 machine gunners to take up positions behind our backs and at a considerable distance from each other. So woe to those who try to leave the battlefield. I grinned wickedly, remembering the propaganda stories about Soviet commissars holding the fighters at gunpoint. Minutes seemed like years. We felt that the attack was inevitable and about to begin, but it did not start. Exhausted soldiers sat silently in the trench. Some of them turned their backs to the enemy. From time to time, stray bullets flew into the trench, but no one seemed to care. The men were no longer trying to escape death. I was close by, but I couldn't say anything encouraging to them. We had 6 rounds of ammunition left per man. What difference does it make to die now or a few moments later? It was getting light. There was movement in the village. People were walking between the huts, gathering in small groups and discussing something. I noticed several Italians I knew, and among them Colonel Masciotti, the commander of the 30th Brigade. What were they going to do? And what was going to happen to us now? Actually, we would be attacked by superior enemy forces any minute now, so we should hardly be interested in what was going on behind our backs. I picked up my rifle. It turned out that there was a shell casing stuck in the barrel, and I had no idea how to get it out. I angrily tossed the unfortunate piece of iron aside. Now it was more dangerous for me than for the enemy. I'd have to fight with just my gun. There's nothing else. Perhaps it was time to destroy my journal. I had no other possessions with me. In its pages I wrote down my critical thoughts about the Germans, and I actively disliked the idea that my notes could be used by someone to organize a propaganda campaign. So with a sigh I took out of my pocket 3 notebooks, which from the very first day of my stay on the Russian front I had filled with my impressions of the war. But there was nothing to do, so I tore them into pieces, which I then buried in the snow. After that, unexpectedly for myself, I decided to take off my officers' stars. I remembered the stories about infantry officers going into battle without insignia, about the subtle tortures to which the Bolsheviks subjected captured Italian officers. If I were to fall alive into the hands of the enemy, I would pretend to be a simple soldier, I decided. Although, most likely, it is useless. Unlike my compatriots, I still wore a long officer's overcoat. In addition, I continued to wear a belt with a holster. Thus, I was too easily recognized as an officer, even without the stars. Nevertheless, I took them off, struggling to move my fingers, numbed by the cold. I had been in the war long enough, but until now it had never occurred to me that I might commit such a sacrilege. Only the proximity of danger had pushed me to a truly terrible step, and the memory of that transgression would stay with me forever. On that occasion, and alas, there will be others, I was led by an irresistible force called the instinct of self-preservation. Later I repented sincerely and decided that if I was captured, I would immediately announce to everyone that I was an officer, and Major Bellini would confirm it. But this was a poor consolation. My memory retains everything, even those facts which I would like to forget. And then, to complete the execution of my cowardly plan to save my own skin, I shredded all my papers. In addition, I destroyed or buried the sacred relics I had always carried with me. My mother had given them to me before I left for the war. I was afraid to imagine that they might fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. Then, having checked the pistol once more, I sat down on the snow, waiting for the enemy to attack. The thought of death no longer frightened me too much. Although it wasn't quite so, something in the back of my mind was violently protesting against the prospect of a near end. I tried to imagine myself as a cold corpse slowly cooling in the snow, but I couldn't. It's amazing how tightly one clings to life. Many times in the past, the thought of death hadn't seemed to particularly bother me. But every time I looked at the bony face, it turned out that I desperately wanted to live. I analyzed my own thoughts and feelings a lot, often observed the behavior of other people, and came to the conclusion that even the most desperate daredevils who commit reckless acts always hope to stay alive. The thirst for life invariably remains in the soul, It cannot be expelled from there. I felt it. I tried not to think about death, to adjust myself to indifference to everything around me, but I could not. In the heat of battle, man is playing a grand game with death, the stakes of which are life. If death suddenly catches up with him, well, then he has lost. If the bony one approaches slowly, advances, presses to the edge of the grave, even the most strong-willed person will not be able to remain indifferent. At some point I thought that God could not help but be touched by my mother's fervent prayers. This thought brought me some comfort. It was getting light. Suddenly I was seized with rage. I was terribly angry with the Germans, who treated us as servants, and annoyed with my own countrymen. To think that for 7 hours we had been sitting in a trench in the bitter cold, and not one of them had thought of changing us. I got out of the trench and, ignoring the German machine gunners, ran to look for the colonel. He must be waiting for us to freeze to death. I found him quickly enough. He promised to take control of the situation immediately. But when I returned to the trench, the Italian soldiers were gone. They had been released by the Germans, who were standing there, next to their guns. I had been absent for no more than 4 minutes. In the meantime, the Italian soldiers began to gather together again. I thought they were planning an attack in a particular area to clear a passage, but it turned out that the men were preparing for a bayonet attack simultaneously in all directions in order to widen the enemy's ring. With quite a number of men gathered in an extremely limited space, any shelling would end in 2 heavy casualties. Very soon the plans laid out were put into action. Walking through the village, I came across a small group of old artillerymen vecchi from the 2nd Battery. Among them was Guido Rivolta from Pina, a village very close to mine. Rivolta considered himself my Pisano, which means a lot to Italian soldiers. When he saw me, he smiled his slightly odd smile, which always seemed tortured, though in reality it was not. Continuing to smile unnaturally, Rivolta informed me that he had some dry cookies to share with me. Besides, he added, "I've already had a snack." I was well aware that he was as hungry as everyone else, but nevertheless gratefully accepted the generous offer. Rivolta had no sooner taken the galettes out of his pocket. Just at that time, a large group of soldiers passed us. They were moving in a northeasterly direction toward the slope. Immediately forgetting my recent worries, I joined them. Such is our Italian temperament. I was still determined to fight, to fulfill my duty as a soldier. It was not enough for long. My vecchi followed me. On the way, I picked up a derelict musket. There were quite a few Italian weapons scattered on the snow. I'm sad to say that they didn't only belong to the dead. We passed through a narrow hollow, at the exit of which we found several corpses. Apparently, death had caught up with people recently. We could hear the sound of battle ahead. We walked a little further, came out into the open and found ourselves under enemy fire. Shouting and laughing, we ran forward. Someone next to me cried out and fell down. What was it? Could it be that a sniper, a Cecchino, had glimpsed my long officer's overcoat? Or was the fire directed at our whole group? Suddenly I felt a faint blow somewhere near the back of my head. I tilted my head slightly. It felt as if I had been slapped, but I didn't stop. Our group, there were other officers in it, by the way, mingled with the other runners. When I reached a small hollow, I squatted down, pulled off my helmet and examined it. I had to find out what had hit me. I found 2 small holes left by the bullet that had shot through the helmet. I felt around my neck and the back of my head and found nothing more than a small scratch. All that remained was to offer a prayer of thanks to the Madonna. Guido Rivolta was always running after me. Now he, too, was near me. His faithful friend was half lying on the snow and looking at me with a kind smile. He took a dry galette out of his pocket and put it in my hand. I broke off half of the generous gift and handed it back to Rivolta. We chewed the stiff bread, while bullets whistled around us. The bayonet attack. It was a day I'll never forget. Not everyone took part. On the contrary, most of our soldiers stayed in the village. They crowded in vain between the huts, dodging enemy fire. Despite this, the enemy was driven back, and by the evening of the same day, the entire valley where Arbuzov was located was in our hands. This was the last outburst of Italian heroism. The best sons of our people perished that day. And this is not eloquence, but a statement of fact. Volta and I ran forward again. There was terrible confusion, and soon I lost sight of my fellow villager. We never met again. It was only later that I realized that this noble man had shared his last piece of bread with me. I noticed the surprisingly accurate shooting of the Russian snipers. Numerous dead bodies were visible everywhere around. I considered myself a good shot. In my youth, I had won shooting competitions quite often, so I decided to become an Italian sniper cecchino. Without thinking long, I stretched out on the snow behind a small hill and began to look for the enemy. There was no shortage of targets, but they were all too far away and moving. Then I managed to catch one figure in the crosshairs, and I squeezed the trigger, then immediately changed my position. How I could use my Russian rifle with telescopic sight now. After all, the Russian snipers used exactly the same kind. From the top of the hill, I descended to the eastern outskirts of Arbuzov. On both sides of the road, going in an unknown direction, stood huts. And there were dead bodies everywhere. Italians. Russians. Italians. Italians. Italians again. From all sides there were loud cries of the wounded. 2 soldiers, probably orderlies, were hurriedly taking and carrying those who at first glance could still be saved to the infirmary. The rest waited for their end, curled up in the snow. I went forward. Bullets were whistling past. On the way I saw a German mortar spitting out deadly shells. It was set up under the cover of a dilapidated hut. Around it fussed the Germans, dressed in their bulky, dirty white hoods. On all sides the huts were burning. But the flames seemed to me somehow sluggish, not threatening at all. It was probably frozen too. I took my position again behind the hill among the dead bodies and began to fire at the enemy. Bullets whistled threateningly around me. I picked up my helmet, which was lying on the snow. It was painted brown. The thing is that, unlike German headgear, ours had no white spots. I noticed a small bullet hole in the place that should have covered the forehead of the previous owner, and I was reluctant to put it on. I hesitated and put it on backwards, but threw it away after a few seconds. All the while I kept watching the enemy's movements between the huts. Now there was a perfect target. I took careful aim and fired. Did I hit it? I don't know. Anyway, the target disappeared. I decided to walk a little further forward. Choosing a new position, I ran across the road several times. None of the bullets hit me. A little away from the road, I saw a group of 4 or 5 Italian soldiers hiding behind a very unreliable cover, a haystack covered with snow. Around them lay numerous dead bodies. Crouching down, I crossed the road again and fell on the snow beside them. The boys looked at me fearfully. One of them said, "Providence preserve you, Signor Tenente." About 40 meters ahead, a Russian machine gunner was lodged. No one has been able to approach here, though many have tried, and he pointed to the corpses frozen around in bizarre poses. "I don't know how you managed." I looked around. Indeed, the Russian machine gunner had done a good job. What to do? We really needed a mortar. I thought of the German one, set a little farther away. But it would be useless to send a soldier there. The Germans wouldn't talk to him. And in any case, they would hardly like the idea of being a target for a Russian machine gun. But still, something had to be done. How long could we sit idly by? I got up again and cautiously headed towards the road, hiding behind any cover, including corpses. Providence had mercy on me again. I made it safely through the gunfire and remained unharmed. Finding myself in relative safety, I hurried toward the German mortars. But as I approached, it turned out that the Germans were just explaining to the other Italians that they had run out of ammunition. And those shells which were lying nearby in the snow are not suitable. They are of a different caliber and probably left here by the Russians. It was urgent to find shells, but the mortars were obviously not in a hurry to do it. I decided to go personally to the German commander, whose headquarters was located in the village, and immediately set off. Between the huts stood quite a number of people. They were mostly Germans, quietly waiting for the end of the attack. Closer to the road could be seen many corpses. In the village near the hut where the German headquarters was located, I came across an Italian colonel and explained to him the ammunition situation. After a while I ascertained that the sleds loaded with shells had departed in the direction from which I had just come. Many Italians had gathered around the German headquarters. Among them were the wounded and frostbitten, and minute by minute loud groans came from all sides. A few soldiers were collecting weapons and ammunition scattered on the snow. I pocketed a few full magazines and turned back, intending to return to the battlefield. But the battle was not only in the area where I had been not so long ago. Hiding behind one of the huts, I could watch the amazing action that was taking place on the opposite side of the valley. Their furious attack was in progress. The Germans and Italians were advancing, and to meet them, from somewhere out of the snowy whiteness, one after another Russian soldiers came out with raised hands. An astonishing, exciting spectacle. The Germans standing next to me watched the events with complete impassivity. I went on my way. In a narrow passage between two huts, put a 20mm German gun for fire support to the soldiers leading a bayonet attack on the opposite edge of the valley, where the Russians were now surrendering. But when they opened fire, someone realized that this was the Germans' way of firing at the Italians. There were shouts. It was necessary to immediately order the German soldiers to stop firing. But when I ran up, the soldiers were no longer firing. They looked at me with obvious dislike. I went on. Russian prisoners were periodically brought to the German headquarters. They were accompanied by our soldiers. The wounded were led or carried to dressing stations. I paid attention to one who wandered for medical help accompanied by his friend. Behind the wounded man stretched a trail of blood, which seemed unusually bright against the white snow. I stopped the boys and inquired what had happened. The bullet, having ruptured the blood vessels, had lodged in the muscle of the arm. The unfortunate had lost a lot of blood, and now it continued to flow out of the wound onto the white snow drop by drop. Along with the blood went the life. Swearing, I took out my dirty handkerchief and pulled the boy's arm as tightly as I could. Then I ordered the boys to hurry up and washed my bloody hands thoroughly with snow. The handkerchief was the only one I had. Now I had to tear off a piece of lining and use the resulting rag instead of a handkerchief. Soon I met another compatriot with whom we had once studied at the officers' course. His name was Sandro Negrini. He was a very tall, gangly and surprisingly funny guy. He was sitting alone on the doorstep of the hut. Negrini said that he had arrived from Italy only a few days ago, and he had got into such a mess at once. I sympathized. "Do you want to go on the attack?" "For God's sake," he replied. "I've just come from there. I didn't have a single cartridge left." He was holding a frame filled with wax and honey. "By the way, this stuff is a good appetite suppressant. You want to try it?" We chatted some more. I ate some delicious honey and said goodbye to my friend. We never saw each other again. At the place where the German mortars stood, the battle was in full swing. The bayonet attack had obviously reached its highest point. It was evident that the enemy everywhere was retreating and surrendering. I went on. The valley was strewn with dead bodies, mostly of my countrymen, for only our soldiers could march with bayonets on machine guns and automatic rifles. As I said, the Italian soldiers led the bayonet attack. The Germans supported us with artillery fire and provided tank attacks at key points. Our command did not exist by then. I also mentioned that there were 3 or 4 generals among our troops, but they had completely withdrawn from leadership, and we were forced to turn to the German command on all matters. Our generals sat unmolested in the German headquarters, turning themselves into outside observers. I was only a junior officer, but my notions of officer's honor did not allow me to accept this state of affairs. But what angered me even more was our blatant disorganization. Back on the battlefield, I immediately realized that I would be much more useful as a commander than as a sniper. Our officers and soldiers were in obvious confusion, having no idea what to do or in what direction to attack. They were justifiably anxious as the attack took on a disorderly character. It turned out that, although a considerable force of Russians had retreated, in some places they had gained a foothold and were still holding on. As a result, separate pockets of enemy resistance emerged on the territory that we had already reasonably considered our own. The fire was chaotic in all directions, and it was not immediately possible to understand where were ours and where were the enemy's. I decided to stop sniping for a while and return to the German headquarters to clarify the plans and goals of the attack. I ran past burning and destroyed huts. Looking into one of them, I noticed a sack of seeds and poured a few handfuls into my pockets. There was nothing else to eat anyway. The Italian colonel listened to me and went to the Germans for instructions. They replied that the attacking units should advance the farther the better. In my section, the forward units were now fighting on the hillside, stretching from the top of the hill to the bottom. In consultation, Colonel Rossi and I decided to halt and entrench ourselves on this line. A few hundred meters from the German headquarters, I noticed a large group of Italian soldiers huddled together in a ditch. From afar, I could not see what was going on there, so I decided to find out what was going on before returning to the battlefield. They told me the following: directly in front of them was the most overgrown part of the valley with reeds and other vegetation. It was impossible to attack in that direction, and the Russians were still hiding somewhere in the reeds and shooting away very successfully, while remaining invisible. In the section on the right, our soldiers had again climbed the far slope, and were now almost on top of it. At the same time, on the section on the left, the attack was still developing. Raising my head, I tried to see the enemy soldiers hiding in the reeds, and instantly 3 meters in front of me grew snow pillars, and my face was covered with snow. If the shooter had taken a few centimeters higher, he would have killed me. The direction was absolutely right. I was lucky again, and once again I had to say a prayer of thanks to the Madonna. I blindly fired several times in the direction of the reeds and went away. When I returned to the battlefield, I gave the officers and soldiers the instructions I had received. The men began to entrench themselves on the new line. It was the middle of the day. Almost everywhere the attacks had ceased, but still shots were heard everywhere. I went to the village again. I have already told you that the valley seemed completely covered with bodies lying in the most inconceivable positions. Some were still moving, giving signs of life. Unfortunately, there was no doubt that the death of the vast majority of the wounded was a matter of hours. We had neither the capacity nor the strength to give aid to all those who needed it. I knew that several dressing stations had been organized in the village, so I rushed there. The picture before my eyes is difficult to describe in words. The hut was divided into 2 rooms, formerly a room and a hayloft. They were now so crowded that it was impossible to enter. The wounded lay on top of each other, forming terrible stacks. Their groans and screams could be heard outside. When one of the 2 soldiers who had devoted themselves to the care of the wounded tried to give them something to drink, in order to alleviate their suffering in the only way available to them, he had to step on them. But the worst of it was not in the hut. Outside, the situation was even worse. Here on the snow, covered with a thin layer of straw, several hundred wounded men were suffering. Many of them were frozen in the postures in which the dying had been hastily abandoned by their comrades who had dragged them out of the battle. They were crouched and prostrate, not close together, so that they could walk freely between them. The men lay silent, some of them covered by scraps of blankets that had already hardened in the frost and were as cold and stiff as metal sheets. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. Many of them did not even have blankets, they were wrapped up in overcoats. Among the wounded one could see quite a few corpses. The wounds of these people, which seemed terrible, were carelessly bandaged over their clothes. So many could not withstand the unequal battle with cold, hunger, and loss of blood. It must be said that the dead and the living left in the street were not too different from each other. Both were silent and motionless. There was only one doctor working here, who tried his best, but human strength is not limitless. I heard that the doctor himself had been wounded twice by enemy shell splinters when he performed amputations with an ordinary dangerous razor. The Germans were gathering around. It was better not to go near them. I moved towards the village. In the meantime, the Russians, forced to withdraw from their earlier positions, were constantly shelling Arbuzov and the surrounding area, where many German and Italian soldiers were crowded together. We were shelled by mortars, all existing types of artillery weapons and Katyusha. The dead were no longer counted. It was in Arbuzov that we became intimately acquainted with the universal nightmare called by the affectionate female name Katyusha. 16 130mm shells one after another fell on our heads. Hearing the sound of flying shells, everyone threw themselves flat on the ground. The piercing whistle was followed by explosions. Katyusha preferred to shoot at large crowds of people. When the shelling stopped, we jumped up and rushed away, trying to get away from the terrible place. And the snow was covered with corpses 5, 6, 7. As luck would have it, that night I, too, came under enemy fire and was among those who first lay huddled in the cold snow and then fled, escaping the deadly shells. I joined our main force, waiting for the tanks to arrive, but they were clearly in no hurry. I have often wondered why the explosions of hand grenades are accompanied by such a truly deafening sound, louder than the explosion of any other shell. The coming evening brought an event greeted with joyous shouts. Several German 3-engine airplanes appeared in the sky over our heads, dropping boxes of ammunition and barrels of fuel by parachute. Then they made a few circles over the valley as a sign of greeting and disappeared from sight. So we were not abandoned to fate. It means that someone remembers and thinks of us. Surely the Germans are in radio contact with the High Command. And sooner or later the long-awaited tanks will come. Night came. I met again with my friends Zorzi, Antonini, Bellini. They told me that our beloved Major Bellini had disappeared somewhere. Dead? Captured? No one knew. He was last seen on December 21st, just before that terrible day when the soldiers started shooting at each other. Poor, poor Major. I shall never forget how last summer, without saying a word to me, he protected me from the severe punishment awaiting me. The postal censor had filed a report about my anti-German sentiments. And after the danger had passed, the Major called me to his office and scolded me severely, recommending that I refrain henceforth from making harsh remarks about the Germans in my letters home. In my mind's eye, I still see him as he was in the first days of the retreat, tall, in a fur coat and a grey knitted helmet, with a blanket thrown over his shoulders, with an invariable cane in his hand. He always addressed me in a paternal, affectionate way. Oh, ragazzo, if only he could come back for a day. That day we missed many more. Junior Lieutenant Silvi, a Tuscan from the 3rd Battery, Captain Rossito, the commander of the 1st Battery. The mournful list seemed to have no end. We could only wonder, where are they, our friends? And also each of us in those moments thought that sooner or later his turn would come. I was looking for a place to get some sleep. I had not been able to rest since the morning, and I felt completely shattered. Near the stable used as an infirmary, I saw people around me hastily falling to the ground and covering their heads with their hands. After that I heard the whistle of flying Katyusha shells. Of course I also collapsed in the snow. It was the first time that I came under such shelling. 16 shells were lying on a line about 200 meters long. I heard the sound of a distant explosion, then closer, even closer. The last ones were very close. The ground around me shook as if in anticipation of a terrible natural cataclysm. There seemed to be no end to the explosions. It was so frightening that I mentally entrusted my soul to God. I got up from the ground unharmed. Katyusha shells formed a golden glowing sphere around themselves when they exploded, as if giant drops of unknown molten substance were falling to the ground. By this feature they could be distinguished from any other projectiles. Finally I lay down on the snow near the hut, where the German headquarters were located, and tried to sleep. Dozorzi and Antonini also found no place indoors and joined me. Antonini lay down next to me. But very soon we realized that it was impossible to remain motionless in such a frost. The cold was unbearable, and the wind, which came at the wrong time, doubled our agony. Feeling that I could not bear it any longer, I got up and went to seek at least a remote semblance of shelter. Once again I waded between the many corpses, but then I envied them. They had become unfeeling blocks of ice, and they no longer felt the cold. I remembered that not long ago I had seen a very attractive haystack, which was a good protection for the many wounded, so I went there. Perhaps I could find a place to sleep there. In a small haystack by the roadside the Germans were sleeping. There was plenty of space nearby, and I could have settled down for the night. But I did not risk disturbing the formidable allies. Just then a big German was fighting with a group of Italian soldiers over a horse. At first the Italians seemed to have the upper hand, but the German called his countrymen to his aid, and they took the horse away, claiming it was a German breed. I did not know what to say to the distressed Italians. The disputed animal belonged to a breed called Normanno. It is more common in Northern Europe than in Italy. In general, our relationship with the Germans was complicated. Finally, I reached the coveted haystack and comfortably settled down for the night without disturbing the countless wounded lying there. I laid some hay on the snow, took off my shoes and socks, stuffed them inside my boots and covered them with hay to keep them from being stolen, then lay down, covered myself with a blanket and piled hay on top for warmth. In this position the cold seemed bearable, and I tried to sleep. The sky overhead was gloomy. Its leaden grey, unkind surface was occasionally illuminated by bright flashes, which, together with the rumble of explosions coming from all sides, did not let me forget that there was a war going on. A few meters from where I was sleeping, the horses in the empty sleigh snorted restlessly. At times they shuffled from foot to foot, and sometimes they froze in complete immobility, like living monuments to frost-torn flesh. Suddenly one of the horses took a few steps toward me and began noisily chewing the hay under which I was hiding from the cold. To drive the guest away, I shoved its snow-covered brown muzzle with my fist and shoveled more hay at it, but the muzzle promptly reappeared in the same place and returned to its interrupted occupation. I pounded it again with my fist. No effect. It was repeated several times. The horse was hungry. Even though it felt the pain of my blows, the hunger was clearly stronger. Finally, I got up with a grunt and pushed the sled a few meters farther away. Then I lay down and instantly fell asleep. But not for long. Soon enough I woke up, clenching my teeth loudly from the cold. The insistent horse had returned and chewed my hay blanket. Filled with rage, I almost shot the vicious animal. The only thing that stopped me was the thought that the horse could still be useful in transporting the wounded. It turned out that the haystack had attracted the attention of many. More and more soldiers, attracted by the opportunity to camp for the night, gradually converged here. Several men had climbed to the top of the haystack and were now throwing hay down. The area covered with prostrate bodies was rapidly increasing in size. I was lying on the edge of a long row of wounded men. The place beside me, between two wounded men, seemed vacant. I knew there was a man there, just not visible under the layer of hay. But the new arrivals did not suspect this, and, noticing a vacant corner, immediately tried to occupy it and fell on the hidden wounded man. He groaned and swore loudly. This little incident was repeated several times during the night. Once the horse, which was standing unharnessed, also decided, following the example of his friend, to come to the bunkhouse to have supper. However, in order to get to the coveted food, it had to walk over the people lying on the ground. The horse didn't like that. Sleeping in the snow didn't either. The icy wind had increased. Now its menacing, droning howl could be heard on all sides. And then, to top it all off, it began to snow. They say that when it snows, the frost lessens. But that's not true. It was so cold that not everyone who had burrowed in the hay, hoping to sleep, managed to wake up. I thought of the wounded lying in the snow near another infirmary down in the village. There, nothing could protect them from the piercing wind. They had little or no hay, and the wretched remnants of it were strewn about them. I decided that I had to do something to take care of the people freezing below. Perhaps I should take some of the soldiers and go to the village and carry some hay down there so that the wounded could take shelter. But I couldn't bring myself to get up, to put on my socks, which had turned into disgusting lumps of ice, and my frozen boots. Still hesitating, I noticed Corsi, Antonini and several other officers from the 30th Brigade approaching. They too were seeking shelter from the wind. I suggested that Tazorzi join me in carrying hay to the wounded. He replied that he was dead tired and hardly capable of such a heroic act. We burrowed into the hay and prepared to sleep. But I could not sleep. I was troubled by disturbing thoughts which had visited me quite often lately. They forced me to rethink my life positions, to look at many familiar things in a new way. Stop filling my head with thoughts about the need to help others. It is necessary to face the truth. Our retreat is not a systematic withdrawal to pre-prepared positions. It's a panicked flight, a desperate attempt to avoid mass slaughter. After some careful thinking, I came to the conclusion that the first thing to do was to save my own skin. I remembered the enthusiastic enthusiasm, the boyish passion that had guided me at the beginning of my military service. All this was before the retreat began. Suffice it to say that I was twice presented for awards. Had the retreat begun 2 weeks later, I would have received those medals. It's strange to remember how confident I was then. But only a few days had passed. From the very beginning of the war campaign, I had been unshakably convinced of the need to fulfill my duty with dignity. It was this conviction that made me risk my life several times under different circumstances. And now, lying in the snow, I was forced to recognize that there is something stronger than death. Already many people had died. They were dying one by one, 10, 100, 1,000. A man can only die once. He can't die indefinitely. Of course, if he's human. I'm not going to make excuses, and I realized perfectly well that I was selfish that night. By the way, after deciding to take care of myself, I somehow found it harder to pray. But nevertheless, I am sure that I survived in Arbizov only because of this selfish decision. And later, when we were already far away, I fully redeemed myself and saved many lives. Everything happens as it pleases Providence, which in days of great trials leads people by the hands as if they were little children. At last I fell asleep. A few hours later I awoke again. My teeth were habitually chattering, and I was shivering with cold. The companions around me, though tired to the extreme, could not sleep any longer either. I talked to a soldier lying next to me, who was restlessly tossing and turning on the spiky bed. He turned out to be quite an educated fellow. And since he considered me a simple soldier, we talked as equals, and both of us enjoyed the conversation. The icy wind whistled in the impenetrable darkness above our heads. The winter night seemed endless. I fell asleep again. Before dawn I was awakened by a loud cry, "The Russians." The Russians are coming. All the healthy soldiers, about 100 of them, had come here during the night, jumped to their feet, and scrambled about in a frantic manner. I began to put on my shoes quickly. One of the 4 socks had disappeared, and I pulled on the other 3, cursing. The socks had no heels, so when I pulled on my boots, I felt my unfortunate heels touch the icy inside of the boots, and I shuddered. After struggling to get my shoes on, I picked up my musket and tried to figure out what was going on. On the way, I remembered the 2 grenades I had thoughtfully placed in my pockets and checked them. They were in order. Eventually, I realized that the alarm was a false alarm. It was dark. I headed down into the village. Grey figures wandered between the huts, huddled together in the snow. The living and the dead waited for the dawn, and it was not slow in coming. I hurried to the infirmary around which lay the wounded. The thought of them had kept me awake during the night. The lying men, covered with blankets, overcoats and strange rags, were now covered with a layer of snow that had fallen during the night. In some places it had already been disturbed, for the people under it were moving, some even standing up. But in some places it remained pristine and undisturbed. Exactly what I had feared had happened. Overnight, many of the wounded had frozen to lifeless ice. I brushed the snow off one of the men and lifted the blanket. A dead face, slightly touched with yellowing yellow, looked up at me. I remembered this man. He had been shot in the stomach. The guy had been hastily bandaged, but the first aid man hadn't even bothered to adjust the poor man's clothes. His stomach was still naked. Unable to move, the poor man was freezing. I started pulling blankets and overcoats off the corpses to cover the living. Unfortunately, the soldiers tramping around were not eager to come to my aid, in spite of my very definite orders. It was only after I threatened them with my pistol that the soldiers reluctantly obeyed. It occurred to me that the corpses could be stripped. I must confess that I was very much attracted by the fur coats in which many of them were dressed. I did not manage to get one myself. I should note that undressing frozen corpses is not for the faint-hearted. But I, alas, could not keep warm clothes. When the freezing wounded saw the coveted half-coats in my hands, there were shouts from all sides. Hands were stretched out. Someone even crawled towards me, making loud groans. Then I decided that I should better organize the process of distributing drinking water. A few soldiers took the initiative and were already carrying water to those who were suffering. I got more people involved, and in a very short time the drinking water problem was completely solved. I also carried water to the bedridden, trying to give each one a drink from a small metal mug. It was so cold that my lips stuck to the metal. Everywhere the delirious people demanded water. I stopped near each one and carefully drank the half-dead soldiers. In addition, I told everyone that columns of tanks and other equipment were on their way, that very soon trucks would come and take everyone to the hospital. How they waited. How sincerely they hoped. How many of them died with this hope in their hearts. But the trucks never came. At last I collected straw lying on the snow and covered the wounded with it. After that I went back to the village. The enemy's heavy guns started shelling again. I vaguely remember that morning. I think I wandered around the village for a long time. First I looked for something to eat, then I hid from the shelling. Climbing up a slope I found, much to my surprise, an abandoned Alfa Romeo belonging to General X. Inside I found a can of completely frozen canned meat, which I immediately shared with someone, but I don't remember with whom. From above I could clearly see how down in the village the Germans were periodically organized in columns, which after a while disintegrated, and no one moved anywhere. What was going on? Having wavered without any information, I approached one of the Germans asking him when the tanks were coming. His answer was brief but overly clear: no gasoline. That day I witnessed an unusually persistent and very successful Katyusha attack. Every 20 to 30 minutes there was a characteristic whistle followed by explosions. Many huts in Arbazov were on fire. And so it went on all day long. Only in the evening we got a little respite. Several times in the sky above our heads appeared German airplanes dropping all kinds of supplies on parachutes. Each plane dropped 6 shell-shaped bales, then made a circle over the valley and flew away. We watched the foreign birds avidly. Their outlines and colouring seemed strange, alien. So did the uniforms of the German soldiers, but at least they brought some hope, so we enthusiastically welcomed their appearance and always waited impatiently. The Germans fired flares toward them, but I think more to express their joy than out of necessity. In addition to supplies, barrels of fuel were dropped from airplanes. Each of us secretly wished that at least one Italian airplane would appear over our heads. We longed for someone to remember us too, but reality was surprisingly cruel to us. And all the way to Chertkov we didn't see a single one of our planes in the sky. Here's that evening German planes came often, but unfortunately not all parachutes opened, and some parcels fell to the ground with a stone. Those that contained ammunition exploded. One of such gifts fell on the territory where the Italians were stationed. An explosion followed, accompanied by a gigantic column of smoke. There was a rumor that the general and all our colonels were killed. Later it turned out that the explosion actually killed a colonel and several senior officers. I met again with Mario Bellini, a friend of mine from Assisi. Since the beginning of the retreat he had not taken off his dark green knitted helmet decorated with a tassel of the same colour. For some reason, that particular tassel reminded me of carefree ski trips. We used to go skiing so often in the winter in our distant homeland. Now it was hard to believe that we had such happy moments in our lives. Severe face Bellini in profile resembled the features of the ancient Roman legionnaire. In addition, he was tall, broad shoulders, and very strong. We studied together at the officers' course in Moncalieri, then fell into the same military camp, from where again together went to Russia. All on the way we seriously quarrelled, and dislike for each other lasted for quite a long time, perhaps until the beginning of the Battle of the Don. In this battle Bellini was presented with a silver medal. Meeting many months later, we exchanged only cold handshakes. That day his observation group and my battalion were defeated by the enemy, after which we long and difficult to get away from the pursuit. Joint combat operations showed how petty and insignificant our mutual offences. We became friends again. Now we were walking peacefully side by side with our hands in our pockets and were having a leisurely conversation. The shelling had stopped. Even the frost seemed to have eased a little. We were walking along a road trampled in the snow, which ran along a long row of huts and connected the large and small massifs of the Arbuzovsky houses. The road was wide and led up the slope. Directly in front of us the pale winter sun, which had finished its journey across the gloomy winter sky, was slowly setting, gradually sinking behind the crest of the hill. We walked past huts set on fire by Katyushas, past corpses frozen in the snow. Some had died recently and still looked like people frozen in immobility. Others had been dead for a long time. From afar they looked like shapeless heaps of rags covered with snow, and only on closer examination it became clear that this oblong drift had once been a human being. The bayonet attack had not missed this place. Here, mixed with the corpses of Italians, there were also Russians, though the Italians were obviously outnumbered. A Russian Maxim machine gun stood on the road, with its dead owners curled up beside it. A little farther away could be seen a whole group of Italians who had evidently been mowed down by a line from this machine gun. Their bayonets were fixed in the fighting position. Near them lay a black-shirted soldier, a rifle with a bayonet ready for attack peeping out from under his body. Probably this brave soldier running to the attack could have been a serious threat to the enemy, but there was nothing frightening about his dead figure now. I leaned over and looked into his face. All I could read on it was resentment and pity. So many dead. The gruesome sight burned too painfully. And in the distant homeland, relatives and friends do not yet know that these unfortunate people are no longer in the world. Here, in Russia, we experienced a terrible tragedy that seemed to concern no one but us. We were dying, and our newspapers and radio were telling about anything but us. It was as if the country had forgotten about us. In the morning there was a rumor that the Germans had shot all the Russian prisoners. Only the Italians, as a result of a bayonet attack, took more than 200 people prisoner. Later the rumors were confirmed. Some details even reached us. They said that the prisoners were built in rows of 10 people, along which a soldier walked and shot, most often in the head. As far as I know, none of the prisoners survived. I saw the bodies of some of them. I remember a Russian boy dressed in a soldier's uniform. He was no more than 16 years old. He was lying with his arms and legs spread and looking with wide open, unseeing eyes into the distance. A small hole in his temple showed where the bullet that had killed the young man had struck. Some soldiers came up to me and gave me orders to go to the village immediately. I had to stop the cheese distribution, and in a few minutes I found myself back on the corpse-lined slope on the road leading down. I had cheese in my hands, and so the soldiers followed me like tethered men. They insisted that the tidbits be given exclusively to the guys from the 30th Brigade. Soon they got tired of following me, and the one who brought the cheese demanded that I give him back the rest. I didn't argue, just broke off a small piece for myself and another, slightly larger, for the colonel and the officers. The latter I handed to an artilleryman I knew well, named Clementi. This silent, dark-eyed southerner seemed a perfectly reliable man. He was a member of my observation group and had shown himself splendidly in the battles on the Don. Perhaps he was one of my bravest soldiers. On the way I ate my piece of cheese and thanked the Lord for sending me much-needed food. Down in the village everything came into motion. A rumor spread that we were leaving. I shuddered at the thought of how many helpless wounded men would be left in Arbuzov to be slaughtered by the ruthless enemy. I went to the infirmary next to the German headquarters to see if any of my friends, my vecchi, were still there. I walked for a long time between the wounded lying in the snow and asked loudly, "Is there anyone here from the 30th Artillery?" No one answered me. I was just about to leave when I heard a faint voice, "Signor Tenente." I turned around and saw a stubby, fair-haired soldier whose face seemed vaguely familiar. "Signor Tenente," he spoke again, "you see, I am wounded." "How lucky you are. You were in the thick of it all the time, and you survived." The voice sounded familiar to me, but I could not remember who it was. "But who are you?" I asked in confusion. "I am Capalino, the new signalman of the 2nd Battery." Here I recognized the young man at once. It was with my light hand that he got his nickname Capalino. He told me his name, but unfortunately I can't remember it now. I immediately began to think feverishly how I could save the unfortunate man. There was only one way out: to find a place on a sledge or some other transportation. So I went in search of a sledge. In a few minutes I managed to find one, and it was empty. I don't remember what the driver told me. Most likely he explained that they were meant for someone else. Politely, but with a clear threat in his voice, I ordered him to take the Capalino. Clementi helped me lift and settle the wounded man. I ordered Clementi to accompany the sled and carefully make sure the soldier stayed on it, and to give the wounded man a piece of officer's cheese. Capalino thanked me with tears in his eyes. He was so moved that he could hardly speak. Lying on the sledge, he even tried to smile. I followed the sleigh for a long time until it disappeared from sight. Clementi also disappeared with the sled, and I never saw him again. Needless to say, the officers never got any cheese. A few days later I saw Capalino already in Chertkov. He told me that he had travelled only a few kilometers on the sleigh, after which the horse collapsed dead on the road. He managed to walk the rest of the way to the settlement with great difficulty. He also said that Clementi had taken my order very seriously and had not lost sight of the sleigh for a moment. An infirmary was set up in the very centre of the village. It was a small house with haylofts. Inside, on the earth floors covered with straw, as well as in the street, the wounded were lying on the snow. They were all in an extremely agitated state. People already knew that the troops were going to leave the village and were worried about their fate. We believed that we would really leave Arbuzov as soon as the long-awaited tanks arrived. And we also believed that together with the tanks, trucks were coming to take away the wounded. That was what I explained to the half-dead men, who were desperately begging me not to abandon them to the mercy of the enemy. There was silence for a moment, and then a voice said, "We can only hope that this is true. We all know that the Germans killed Russian prisoners. We have nothing to count on if the Russians find us here, surrounded by their shot men." The infantryman I wounded in the back on our first day in Arbuzov was also in the infirmary. He was lying quietly against the wall. When I called out to him, he recognized me at once, and again, like a wounded man, began to tell us not to leave him. Looking into his wide-open eyes, I asked myself again whether this man, in his unconsciousness, had shot at us or not. I was not destined to get a definite answer to the question that tormented me. In those days, a lot of people went insane. And at the same time, many of them were temporarily insane, after which they returned to their normal state. So now, scrutinizing this man's face, I could not come to any reasonable conclusion. Poor bastard. I did my best to find him a place on the sled or in the truck. But there was no second miracle. Not even a mouse could find a nook on a transport crowded with wounded Italians. The Germans' sleds were moving half empty, but I could not persuade any of them to take just one of our wounded. As a result, I was forced to give up my fruitless attempts. I was somewhat relieved, however, when I received an order telling us to all gather down in the valley without worrying about the wounded, as they would all be taken by the men assigned to them. We did leave the Arbuzov after all. Providence had entrusted me with the lives of many people whom I was to take to safety, but I did not fulfill my promise and left the infantryman who was wounded by me. I still sometimes think I hear his voice breaking. "Signor Tenente, I beg you, don't leave me." And his reply, "Don't worry, I won't leave you. I always keep my promises." With a heavy heart, I walked down to the assembly point. What awaited me there? Crossing a small vacant lot, I saw a huge German tank whose gun had been blown away by a direct hit from a shell. Looking closer, I found that the flamethrower was also missing. However, the whole front part of the tank had been torn apart. Unfortunately, the number of tanks on which we had pinned our main hopes was diminishing every day. When we left Death Valley, there were only 5 or 6 of them left. The rest, for lack of fuel, were put out of action and abandoned. Surrounded by numerous soldiers and officers, I stood on the ice of a frozen pond. Trucks with the wounded were also coming this way. They stopped on the road or drove back and forth. It was quite obvious that the drivers did not know what to do. The Russians began shelling the village again. The coming day was not a happy exception and brought a huge number of wounded and killed. The Katyusha shells spared no one. They exploded among the wounded lying in the snow, tearing apart their already crippled bodies. Those who were spared by the shells died of cold. Some soldiers, exhausted by the incessant shelling, hunger and the killing cold, lost the will to live. They laid down on the snow and, without moving, silently waited for death. The hope for the approaching column of tanks was getting weaker and weaker. Shots rang out too close. To the right and to the left began to appear columns of snow raised by enemy bullets. Bare tree branches cut by the shots fell on our long-suffering heads. After that, shells began to explode minute by minute. Again shelling. There was nowhere to hide. Desperate people used even the most inconspicuous holes and hollows as hiding places. It seemed like an eternity before the order came all Italians to gather in a wooded gully in the valley in front of Arbuzov. After a while, the Italians converged on the place indicated and even formed up. There were 4,000 or 5,000 of us, which meant that many people were lost somewhere in the Valley of Death. The passage into the gully, a natural cleft in the ground, was about 100 meters wide and 4 to 5 meters deep. Its bottom was fairly flat. Since the passage turned out to be quite winding, I can't say anything about its length. And here the bayonet attack took place. Its mute witness Russian machine gun Maxim frozen on the edge of the cliff. Nearby lay the corpses of Russian machine gunners. General X gathered all the surviving officers, which amounted to about 100. We sincerely hoped that he would give us good news. Instead, we heard that we should organize the men and fight the enemy as long as we had strength. Perhaps an armored column would be coming up soon. But maybe not. Then we are to die in battle. The general said something else, but we didn't want to believe our own ears. We were doomed to die. Soon the general released the officers, and we went to our units gathered in the gully. All around we could see sparse bare trees with men standing between them. Loud, curt commands were heard. Then someone said that it was necessary to speak more quietly because the enemy was very close. The 30th Brigade formed up. I walked along the lines, calling people to order. I was among my own again. All of us were no longer the same. The hardships and deprivations that had fallen to our lot could break anyone. Our faces had changed beyond recognition, thin, gaunt. Only the eyes remained the same. By them we recognized each other. Among us was our commander, Colonel Matiotti. His always neatly shaved face is now covered with grey stubble. Of the 3 battalion commanders survived 1 Major W. I was happy to see my good friend Veronese di Zoilo Zorzi. How wonderful it is to be able to have a few words with him. There was also Mario Bellini, who had been pestering me for a long time about where I had gone the previous night. I saw again the junior lieutenants and lieutenants Antonini, Candela, Bona, Cinzi, Maestri, Tavataro, and Captains Pontoriero, Verena, and Barcelona. But how many we were missing. With us was no longer our kind. Always fatherly smiling Major, somewhere disappeared the commander of the 62nd Battalion. Later I met him, but it was after we left the encirclement. The youngest of the junior lieutenants was missing Palesiano, a smiling young man from Taranto. The boys said they had seen his dead body. In a week he was to be 20 years old. Captain Verena, a native of Como, our chief supply officer, had somewhere obtained a large red cow, which one of the soldiers was now pulling by a rope tied to its horns. The animal breathed noisily and followed us, apparently resigned to its fate. The captain was going to slaughter the cow at the first opportunity and feed the men a hot meal. Colonel Matiotti divided the men into 2 roughly equal groups, armed and unarmed. From the armed soldiers formed 4 or 5 platoons of 20 men each. Capable officers were placed at the head of each platoon. I, Di Zoilo Zorzi, and Mario Bellini were left alone for the time being. The platoons were ready to go into battle, and I suddenly felt a burning desire to be with them, with my friends. Some devil inside did not give me rest and insistently demanded that I again went into the scorcher. But I had no time to show myself, for just at that moment Corsi came forward and quietly asked the colonel to let him join the platoon. He had the usual expression on his plain face, sincere, and at the same time modest, even perhaps a little shy. It was with this expression that he always called his friends to order, some of whose frivolous jokes, being a devout Catholic, he did not approve. The colonel granted his request, and the soldiers immediately set out for Arbuzov. Bellini and I looked in silence after Siorzi. We never saw him again. Let my words be a tribute to Corsi, the best man I ever met on the roads of war. He was a simple but wise man, much loved by the soldiers. He was also brave, but he had not reckless courage, but the real courage of a reasonable man. I had hoped for a long time, my friend Sorzi, that you were alive. And whenever fate threw me to a new place, I expected to see your calm face, to hear your quiet voice. But that's not what happened. When the snow melts and spring streams start running everywhere, you will lie motionless in the mud on the country road, and will not be able to rejoice at the first warmth. The liquid clay will hide your eyes, whose last look was to God. I made a vow that you would come home. We had to go together to fulfill that vow. But you went alone, and you did not return. I'm sure I'll turn to you in my mind many times over, for it is your counsel that I miss so much in this life. How thin the barrier that separates us. We will walk side by side again, as we did in 1942, shoulder to shoulder, on the roads of war across the vast Russian steppe. Do you remember the wailing cry of the quail, which we first heard in those very places? Today your white bones are already mixed with the earth and grass, and quails still cry over them as if crying over the dead. When the armed forces left, we were ordered to stay in the same ravine until new orders. We were forbidden to light fires or even to talk loudly. Captains Verena and Barcelona went to look for a place where it would be convenient to slaughter a cow. On the way they were stopped by an unfamiliar senior officer and ordered Captain Barcelona to take command of the newly formed company. We never saw him again. There was no longer any way to endure the hellish cold. We tried our best to keep warm, but you can't keep jumping or squatting all day long. The day, which I stubbornly thought was Christmas Day, seemed endless. The soldiers sent to slaughter the cow and prepare food returned empty-handed. They reported that the animal had been taken from them by the Germans, but accompanied by a group of Italians. The former held sway and acted as masters, the latter dragged after them, starving. We were again left without food. We could hear shells exploding in the valley. Katyusha were showing their power. The officers gathered in a small group: Pontoriero, Verena, Bona, San Martino, Antonini, Bellini, Candela, and some others. Occasionally one of us, overcome by fatigue, would sink to the snow in exhaustion, but every time he would get up very quickly. We tried to discuss the situation, but it was hard to talk and think in this cold. Because of the cold, none of us risked taking off our gloves, so even the most avid smokers had to think seriously before deciding to smoke. Everyone wondered if the tanks were coming, but they tried not to talk about it out loud. We were so hungry that we were mentally eating all the time, and we imagined ourselves eating the most exquisite dishes. I thought of the appetizing bars of chocolate, jars of honey, and other goodies that had been sent to me from home, and that I had stashed away for Christmas today. The Uzbeks are probably eating them now. I was amused, imagining that together with the sweets the Uzbeks would eat the anti-frostbite cream and shoe polish that were also in my bag, though it was hardly funny. Soon thoughts of food were banished by the pervasive cold, and we started jumping and running in place again. How agonizing was the sensation of icy feet in wet and cold socks. Slowly the hours dragged on. Not far from where we were parked, a picturesque picture could be seen. 5 or 6 dead Italians and a horse, also dead. They must have been overtaken by a shell shortly before we arrived, for the blood was still quite fresh. There was a whole pool of it, in the centre of which lay the horse, which had crushed one of the human bodies. How hideously red the mixture of human and animal blood seemed. It was the only bright spot on the depressingly monotonous, grey-white canvas of the surrounding landscape. Suddenly I made a very difficult decision for me and headed towards the tragic company. The thing is that I noticed a warm officer's scarf around the neck of one of the dead Italians. I pulled it off, tore it into 2 halves and returned to my comrades. Just at that time Lieutenant San Martino, then commanding the 2nd Battery, was sitting in the snow and rubbing his stiffened legs with anti-frostbite grease with fervour. I asked him to share the cream with me, took off my boots and socks, rubbed my long-suffering feet, wrapped them with half a scarf and put my boots back on. It was immediately easier, but now, without socks, my feet were bare above the boots. I had to put on the wet socks again, groaning. We talked a bit about Christmas. In the end, I was convinced that it would not come until the next day. I often left my companions and went for a wander in the ravine. It was easier to keep warm as I walked. At times in our valiant army there was a tremendous panic, because someone reported the appearance of Russians on the edge of the gully. The expected enemies turned out to be Italians. The fight moved closer. Shots were heard very close to us, and shells were flying right over our heads. More and more people began to look with hungry eyes at the dead horse. Some went to it and cut off pieces of meat with bayonets. Since we were strictly forbidden to light a fire, the meat was eaten raw. Judging by the stories, it tasted disgusting, but nevertheless it restored strength. I could not endure the agony of hunger and decided to follow the example of my compatriots. Asking a soldier for a bayonet, I carefully cut off a small piece of meat. Gola, the second battery's third gun loader, nodded encouragingly, looking at the grimace of disgust that contorted my face. His always cheerfully tousled hair was now hidden under his helmet, and his usually lively face now looked small and wrinkled. But he was as practical as ever. I shoved the meat into the snow, and after a while I pulled out a kind of frozen steak. Trying not to look at him, I began to eat. Here, I thought, is payback for my former excesses. When death is near, the sins of man, which in normal circumstances seem only minor transgressions, take on alarming proportions. I was very concerned about the body of the man crushed by the horse. Soldiers were already lining up to cut off their meat. Horse entrails and pieces of hide were falling on the corpse lying below. Some, not looking closely at what lay beneath their feet, stepped on it. I realized that no one would voluntarily agree to pull him out, so I drew my pistol and at gunpoint forced 2 soldiers to help me carry the unfortunate man to another place. While we were preparing to do the mournful work, a Katyusha shell whistled over our heads and exploded only a few dozen meters away. We fell to the ground, covering our heads with our hands. After the shrapnel stopped falling, I stood up and found that my forced helpers were nowhere to be seen. Apparently, they didn't want to deal with a dead body so badly that they cowardly ran away. I had to get 2 other soldiers to do the job. We pulled the dead body out from under the horse and laid it a little farther away. Nearby, we laid the rest of the dead. Now the Katyushas were shelling the area very close to our ravine, only a few hundred meters away. The columns of smoke raised by shell explosions were steadily approaching. A little more, and the mass deaths would begin. We waited with horror for the seemingly inevitable death, but suddenly the explosions began to recede again. Only 1 shell fell into the girder, killing several people. The day was drawing towards evening. We tramped aimlessly in the snow, having lost all hope. But then news reached us that made everyone jump for joy. From the German headquarters came a sergeant who reported that the column of tanks was only 2 hours away. The men stood and waited tensely. Time passed, but no sounds signifying the arrival of the tank column were heard. At sunset, the frost became even worse. In the afternoon, it seemed to us that our strength was running out and we would no longer be able to bear such a murderous cold. It turned out that we could. It got dark. Together with Mario Bellini, we walked up and down the beam. Mario found a forgotten piece of galette in his pocket and shared it with me. How grateful I was to him. We tried to stretch the eating process longer, but alas, a few crumbs of dry cookies did not last long. Traces of tracer bullets appeared in the dark sky. Sometimes we saw them right above our heads. Branches cut by the shots fell on the snow. In the center of the beam, they had built a ridiculous and completely useless structure of dry branches intended for senior officers. But it looked like a house, though it was not, and that must have been why people were always crowding around it. Suddenly a shrill scream came from there. Someone had been shot in the stomach. Under our conditions, such a wounded person had no chance of survival. There was moaning for a while, and then it stopped. And we were again faced with the task of finding a place to sleep. I thought of a hut just next to the ravine. I remembered well that there was a very comfortable haystack next to it. There was also a cellar in the house, where I knew the family hid. Maybe there was room for the 2 of us. It must be delightfully warm. But what if the tanks showed up in our absence? We decided to content ourselves with a few bales of hay and settle down for the night near our own. Providence was again on our side. That night our column left quietly and hastily. While we were camping for the night, a quarrel broke out in a group of soldiers nearby. I went over to find out what was the matter. Several men were struggling to restrain a tall soldier who was lashing out and shouting that it was not his fault. In front of him stood an agitated corporal who claimed that he had been a prisoner of the Russians, had managed to escape, and had seen this soldier socializing with the enemy in a friendly manner, which meant that he was a spy. The soldier shouted that he was in a battalion of the 30th Artillery Brigade. Curious, I came closer. The soldier told such amazing things that I immediately sent for Major Wu, the battalion commander. In the presence of the major, the soldier repeated that he had indeed been taken prisoner by the Russians. He was one of a huge column of Italian prisoners to whom the Russians had announced that they would first be sent to Milerovo, and there loaded on trains and taken to the works. Milerovo is in Russian hands. I looked at Mario Bellini in surprise. If the Russians have advanced so far, then our business is bad. Then we did not believe the soldier. But later it turned out that he told the plain truth. The Russians were already in Milerov and were preparing to close the ring. So we were completely surrounded. Good thing we didn't know that. And the soldier continued his story. Suddenly the guards opened fire on our column. There were thousands of Italians around me, the soldier shouted, and they were all killed. You know, I myself saw the captain. Fell dead, the bullet hit him in the head. The soldier explained that he had escaped only because he had shielded himself with one of his compatriots, whom he knew had sold out to the Russians. He was then released after taking his promise to become a spy. The soldier said that there were many traitors in his battalion who had agreed to spy. He admitted that he had promised to work for the Russians only to save his life. In fact, he did not want to betray anyone and told everything honestly. While the soldier was speaking, indignant shouts were heard all around. The crowd was about to lynch the traitor. The soldier looked scared to death. Could it be that he, like many others, had lost his mind? What if he was telling the truth? We didn't know what to think. Now that I have heard so many accounts from Italians who have survived Russian captivity, I am inclined to think that the soldier was not lying that night. I took Major Wu aside and recounted an episode that had happened 3 days earlier, when a soldier had fired at us camped out for the night. The major replied, "Frankly, I don't know what to think. But one thing seems quite certain to me: soon we will all be in the hands of the Russians and find our end there. I'll keep an eye on this guy and shoot him if I have to. After all, it doesn't matter, we're all going to die anyway." And that was that. Much later, Bellini told me how events unfolded. Major Wu thought it over and decided to take the soldier to General X. Since there were a lot of people who had lost their minds to a greater or lesser degree, and some of them were spy-obsessed, the general, when he learned that the soldier brought to him had been quite a normal guy before the retreat, ordered him to be released. The soldier asked Major Wu to give him a written certificate confirming that he was not a spy. The soldier stated that if he did not get such a paper, he would go to the Russians. Major Wu refused. The soldier left and was never seen again. After the passions subsided, there was silence in the gully. Everyone solved the problem of sleeping in different ways. Some lay down on the snow, huddled close together. Others preferred to stay on their feet. I could hear people talking quietly among themselves. The general mood was that if we had been surrounded not by Russian barbarians, but for example by the English, everyone would have surrendered without a second thought. Mario Bellini and I, as we had intended, went to the exit of the ravine to fetch some hay. There we had to endure a short altercation with the Germans, who expressed their displeasure. They were absolutely indifferent whether we died or survived. The main thing was that no one bothered them. We returned to the girder with 2 large armfuls of hay. We spread some of it on the snow, then lay down, covered ourselves with blankets, on top of which we poured the rest of the hay. I guessed to put my wet socks under my shirt right against my body so that they wouldn't turn into ice in the morning. Cuddled together, we fell asleep. It was Christmas Eve,